to the people.
Power 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 to the people. Power to the people.
Power to the people.
Power to the people.
Great, guys. Okay. So we're going to
I was interning for Daniel Biss's campaign, and a lot of us, found out that he was, speaking today, and, for a lot of us, we're young people working on campaigns, we just got swamped by a, $70 million primary opponent, so that's why, obviously, campaign finance reform is very important to a lot of us. It means that you can have more candidates for office, and more public servants who have incomes and wealth that are similar to the people they're serving. I think that means that they'll have more of an ability to relate to the issues of the people they're serving and help solve those issues, regarding income inequality.
I'm an organizer with Common Cause, and then Bob's going to speak, but he's also an organizer, or he's the founder of Evanston Collective, and we kind of came together to make the coalition called Equitable Evanston, and the idea is that there'll be different reforms for equity, the first one starting with public finance. And this is a really important issue to me for the mere fact that, one, I didn't even know to get involved in anything political or civic engagement until I was in law school. And not a lot of people even, are able to go to law school, so I always think like, wow, this is so important, but why wasn't it important to me beforehand? And then furthermore than that, now that I, have my degrees and I'm working in politics, I don't feel like I could ever run because I can't afford it. So a lot of those things really bring to the forefront why this is an issue. But there's so many other reasons, and I'm excited for you guys to hear about that. Here's Bobby.
So for me, for too many people, local government is something that happens to you and not with you, and therefore it has nothing to do about you. It's about other people. It's about big donors. It's about the frequent voters. All the campaign people in here know about frequent voters. We got some frequent voters in here today. Raise your hand if you're a frequent voter. Have you voted in the last 3 primary elections, right? It's about other people. And to be frank, if you're not a big donor, if you're not a voter, you're invisible during elections, right? And what happens is that because we don't invest in engaging new voters, what happens is people don't show up to council meetings. And if you don't show up to council meetings, you're certainly not going to show up to committee meetings where most of the policy discussions are happening. And so you're not represented. In order to address the stubborn issues in this community, but really statewide, I really feel like we need to fundamentally change the way we run our elections, and we need to fundamentally change the role that government plays in engaging new voters. And another thing we have to do is this. We have to get enough people to commit to joining us on this campaign to fundamentally change these things. So not just one day, not just one election cycle, but who in this room, by a raise of hands, let's just say is willing to commit to this campaign for the next 4 years? Because that's what it's going to take. So I'm excited. I hope everybody in here is excited. Some contracts we're going to pass around in a second. Everybody that raised their hand, we need you to sign to that. 4 years. I'm glad you guys came up. We are going to introduce our next 4 speakers. Each one of them have run in elections. They understand what it takes to win elections. They understand why they maybe lost an election. They understand the role right now that money plays in it, how much time they have to spend fundraising, and so they're going to talk about how they feel campaign finance reform is
Bushra Amiwala.
Hi everyone, my name is Bushra Amiwala. I am a sophomore at DePaul University, majoring in marketing and finance with a double minor in community service studies and public policy studies. I ran for the Cook County Board of Commissioners this past election cycle and lost. However, I'm still here and smiling, so it's all good. And after a lot of reflection, I definitely think that this definitely played a role in that, along with the many other things. But I never ran a campaign before. Clearly, I'm 20 years old, so I don't know what I would have before this. But when I first announced my candidacy, the first thing that people asked me was, how much money have you raised? And how much money can you raise? And in the beginning, I always thought, why do people keep asking me this? I was like, what do you mean? I was like, don't you want to hear my policy ideas? And like, see my website? Like, I have my domain up and going. And they're like, No. How much money do you have? And I come from a family that was never really engaged in politics, and no one in my family had ever given to a political campaign either. There's this thing in Islam called zakat, which is charity work, and that's all they did when it came to giving money. So giving to political campaigns was something that I didn't even know was a thing. Because prior to me running for office, I was just in high school, right? So I announced my candidacy my freshman year of college. So when people kept asking me that over and over, I responded with the question, and my question was, what am I fundraising for? And no one would answer my question. I don't know why no one would answer my question, but now I can tell you the simple things. Sending out mail, paying staff, getting yard signs, having t-shirts and buttons, but for some reason, no one would say that because I think there was a sense of doubt as to what we all are fundraising for anyways. Everyone was kind of like, yeah, I don't know, but you need money to legitimize yourself as a candidate and to legitimize your campaign. So now that my campaign is over, I'll honestly say that I didn't have a fundraising coordinator, I didn't have a campaign manager, I didn't have a political director, I didn't have any of that. I was sort of like a one-woman show, which is embarrassing that I say it now, but if I was doing it before, like, people would not have like stood behind me. But despite that, that means the only reason I didn't have those things or those people to hold these positions was because I couldn't afford it. If you can't afford to have a fundraising director, do you like fundraise yourself to get one? Like, how does that even work? Like, you have to have, like, I was like, is this like a cycle? Like, how do I get this? So I did it all. I was like the one-woman show, and people would, say these quotes to me. It'd be like, a good leader does 20% of the work and delegates 80%. But I'm like, hey, I'm doing 100%. Like, don't call me a bad leader now. But that's what I was doing. So I didn't have friends and family members who also had this like huge pot of gold or this lump sum of money to donate to candidates, because people would say, they're like, Bushra, how many hours of call time are you doing? I was like, what's call time? So call time is printing out your contacts in your cell phone and calling every single person and asking them for a targeted dollar amount. So for example, you'll see like, oh, Bob has like, a small business, well, I'll ask him for 100 as opposed to 150. I don't know. Okay, so I take, I do that. I was like, you know what? Okay, sounds simple enough. I print out my contacts list, and the first person I see is like Angie, who owes me $10 from high school. So I'm like, how much should I ask her for like 20 now to make up for my loss? Like, that's what that looks like. And going down the list, and I see family members, and then I'm like, Mom, I'm about to call my uncle in Florida for like $500 because I know he has a really good job, and she's like, are you kidding me? He's so cheap, he's not going to give you anything. And she was right, he didn't. He gave me $100. He was like, what do you need all this money for? He's like, what? And it's because I was engaging those people who have never given to campaigns before, so a lot of them didn't even realize how expensive it was. And a lot of the people who ended up giving to my campaign were from the South Asian community. So I hosted a fundraising dinner, and I hosted quite a few of those because that's who I got a lot of my money from. And I saw the way that other people had fundraising dinners, and I saw tickets were $1,000. I was like, what? How do you find people willing to pay that much for dinner? Like, what are you serving? Like those gold flakes that they put on things? But, so I made my tickets $50, and even with that, people would call my mom. They'd be like, why is your daughter charging $50 for this fundraising dinner? And she's like, sheesh, what is she doing? But eventually, I got 450 people to attend a dinner, and that's where I raised all of my money from. But seeing that someone could have just invited 30 people and raised the exact same amount of money that I did in one night is what really disappoints me, and I think that alludes to what the problem is. So thank you all.
And so I entered the state rep race, not really fully understanding how much, in fact, it would cost to do that. And so I'm going to ask, just by show of hands, how many of you think a successful state rep race should cost somewhere between $50,000 and $75,000? Okay. How about $75,000 to $100,000? How about more than $100,000? I guess that's the answer. Nice about it. You have to hire at a minimum, really, a campaign manager. Campaign treasurers are often volunteers, but it is the most difficult job in the campaign because the field work, so you get your message out. The two most important things for candidates are the people that you hire and the cost of messaging. And it's extraordinary. I mean, part of what you have to do as a candidate is to try to figure out how many people you need to reach and how many people will vote. You can't possibly win a campaign and go on to do what is really, it's not just the winning of the campaign, it's the doing the important work of being a state legislator that's important. You can't possibly do it unless you can reach the people. And of course, we talk a lot about big money in politics, and I think we need to sort of ask ourselves, well, when we're complaining about this, are we talking about the big money like from the Koch brothers or from Dan Croft, or are we talking about big money from the party, who, when they choose to endorse a person, brings along with it not just the money from the party and the local party units, but also money from unions that want the party support for their agenda in Springfield. So those unions then give money as well. Are we talking about the PACs? Are we talking about unions? Are we talking about people who can self-fund their campaigns? So clearly, I think we all recognize that we don't have a diverse enough voice in politics. And we're not going to be able to get a diverse enough voice in politics unless we are able to change the way we finance our campaigns, and unless we can start to think about what might be reasonable time, place, manner restrictions on the way campaigns are run.
Campaign finance reform is important, not just because we want big money out of politics, it's because we want to empower people to join the democratic process, to feel like they really have a voice in our politics. So I ran about a year ago. I didn't have to raise a ton of money. I raised $15,000 to run my campaign. I'll tell you guys the truth, I spent about 8 hours a week doing call time, which is about a full day a week. And that's how I raised the $15,000 to go on to have a successful campaign. So I also want to say what the clerk's office is doing now very quickly to increase voter participation and to reach these groups. And one of the things we're doing is reaching out to folks who don't traditionally come out. And just outreach to folks has shown to be somewhat effective, but it's not as effective as giving people a real voice in our democracy. I want to talk about in 2017, when we had our municipal elections, we had about 34% turnout. That was the highest that we had had in a long time. We had 12% turnout in the last election. And in 2017, we also saw record. We had a very contested mayoral race. We had a lot of contested aldermanic races, contested clerk's race. But we still only had 34% turnout. And one of the things we saw is that we saw a total of $377,000 spent in the 2017 election, compared with under $150,000 in the election prior to that. The top candidate spent over $232,000, where the next candidate spent $66,000. So big money had an influence in this election. And so we want to make sure that we give folks an opportunity to not only get involved, but have folks have an opportunity to run competitive races. So Seattle is one of the places that I've looked to for a model that I think will work here in Evanston to increase voter participation and reduce the impact that big money can have in our local races. Seattle in 2017, in their 2017 election, for the first time had a voucher program. It was passed with Initiative 122 in 2016. And that was the Honest Election Seattle campaign. And that won with 63% of the vote, and I think that's something we can do here in Evanston. What that did was it made vouchers available for the city attorney's race and the 2 citywide city council races. And the voucher program saw 16,000 folks in the 2 races that the vouchers were eligible for, 16,000 folks donate to candidates. In the non-voucher race, in the mayoral race, only 6,000 folks voted. What's also great is that young folks and people of color were the ones who came out and not only voted in this election, we saw an increase in new voters, but also were first-time donors. A lot of the new voters were also first-time donors using the voucher program. In Seattle, they mail out 4 $25 vouchers to every single registered voter in the city, and if you weren't registered, you were eligible to still receive the vouchers. And it was a great way to increase participation You know, here in Evanston, I think we are hopefully the Seattle of the Midwest. We should be the city that's leading on progressive policy. And so I hope that all of you will stick with that commitment for the long haul to make sure that here in Evanston, we can create elections that are fairer and increase democracy and the voice of the public. So thank you.
I actually did not run my campaign. I was on the verge of running my campaign, and a vacancy came up in the School District 65 School Board, and I luckily was appointed. And again, at the outset of my campaign, which didn't happen, you know, that was a huge concern. Like, how was I going to raise money? And I do have folks who were able to, you know, do things for me. And my wife was willing to be my manager. Although they say my position is going to be up for election a year from now. So again, it's something that's been turning in my head. How am I going to raise money? Who am I going to reach out to? Right. What I do currently in my work as a school board member, I just try to do the work. Right. I try to reach out to folks. I try to, you know, be at schools and be the liaison to the schools that I'm responsible for. Really trying to push a lot of the equity work that we're trying to do as an institution in this community, and also try to work with, you know, colleagues in the community organizations that again are dedicated to equity. Because in the end, for me, public finance is a step towards getting to the journey to equity that our city has been embarked upon. So again, when we're able to make government accessible to folks who've been marginalized historically, I think it's going to really make an incredible difference. I was looking at some demographic numbers for the Latino community again. Since the last census, we had 2000. We were at 6% of the population of Evanston, and it's almost doubled up to 11%. And again, we're coming up on the new census. For me, it's very critical to find more voices that represent our marginalized communities, and it can help our community be this beacon, right, and this lighthouse community, and progressive community that actually values and encourages all of its citizens and non-citizens to participate in decision making and in making this community a better place. And that we have a good public finance system that encourages all folks.
Great, guys. Okay, so we're going to listen to the policy. David Melton and Jay are going to come up. They're two of the smartest people I know. And I told them to make it as fun as possible.
We're here today to talk about power. We're here to talk about restoring balance in our electoral systems. What we haven't talked about is how we got here. You know, there were a handful of really disastrous cases coming out of the Supreme Court that led a handful of really rich people who were not just rich enough to take advantage of the system that those bad decisions created, but they were also organized and smart enough and forward-thinking enough to realize that they could use that system to consolidate power with their money. Money buys access. Access buys influence. And influence creates policy. And what we think at Common Cause and what I think everybody here in this room sort of intrinsically believes is that access, that influence shouldn't just rest in the hands of the few. It really should be as dispersed as possible. Now, again, with these cases, we're never going to get big money completely out of our political system. We have to be honest with ourselves. We're not going to be able to do that. But what we can do is we can bring more people into the system. What we can do is we can empower the folks that are already in the system to have a bigger voice. What we can do is we can help folks, like people in this room, step up and take a leadership position, even if they don't have access to folks in policy. So, right now there are about 30 cities, counties, states around the country that are already using public funds to provide some measure of support. If you could read what's going on in that fourth column, you'd see that, generally speaking, there's three main ways that this happens. They either are matching funds in some form, New York providing the gold standard for that, and my friend David's going to talk a little bit, about the matching funds option, which is sometimes called fair elections. I was asked to talk about is this second system, which Devon talked about, which is sort of a new model known as vouchers. Seattle really provides the latest and greatest understanding of what a voucher could be. We're really talking about every eligible resident in Seattle getting 4 $25 paper ballots of coupons. And you could direct those to the candidate of your choice. You could direct them to a political action committee if you felt so moved. You can send all 4 to one candidate. You could send 1 to your top 4 choices. It would be up to you. The concept is that the politicians that decide to participate in it would have to agree to make some choices which would lower the cost of money. They would have to limit the amount of money that they raise. They would have to agree that they'd only accept less than $250 from any one individual source. It actually changed the outcome. It changed how people actually engage with the system. New political donors got younger. They got more diverse across racial lines, across class lines. What you found out is it's also added to real money. A lot of times when I was working on Senator Biss's bill down in Springfield, I heard from some folks that this would amount to unilateral disarmament. If I agree to participate in this, I'm not going to get real money. And what you see is, in fact, in Seattle, this voucher program actually amounted to real money, with the top 2 candidates maxing out at $300,000. Power, we can do it. David.
So I'm going to talk to you for a minute about small donor matching systems. What is the point of a small donor matching system? The point is to solve the problem that all of these 4 candidates who spoke to you earlier so eloquently described, which is every candidate, unless they're super wealthy, faces a question at the beginning of their campaign. Where am I going to get the money to get my message out to the people? Campaigns cost money in our society. It's not practical to think that you can simply walk around and talk to every voter. So the question is, where are they going to get that money? And unfortunately, there are some rich people who say, this is my opportunity to buy influence, as Jay described. And it's a very tempting place for politicians to go when they have to find a place to get that money. The point of a small donor matching system is to say to politicians, you don't have to sell your soul to those rich people to have a chance at getting elected. You can rely on average voters making relatively small contributions, and that will provide you with enough money to run an effective campaign to get your message out and have a viable chance of getting elected. That's the point of a small donor matching system. Basically, it works like this. You have to prove you're a serious candidate. You prove that by going out and getting signatures or raising a certain amount of small donations to prove that it's not just you, a single gadfly, interested in talking about your own personality, but you're actually a serious candidate. And once you pass that hurdle and you qualify, then donations that you receive up to a level that's determined by the municipality, would be determined by the city council here, are matched. So it would be, for instance, donations up to, say, $150 are matched. And they to be matched at whatever ratio you think is the most effective. But it has to be enough money so that it makes it worth the politician's time to sign up to that system and accept the limitations that that system imposes. So usually it's not just a one-to-one match. New York City, as some of the people have mentioned earlier, uses a 6-to-1 match, and they found that that works effectively. That gives the politician enough incentive to rely on the system and to raise enough money. So that for every $100 that you get from donors, every $100 donation you get $600 from public funds to match it. Okay, up to a certain limit. And the point is to enable politicians to rely on that money to run a viable campaign. So in New York City, as I said, they use a 6-to-1 match. And the program not only enables politicians to focus more on average voters and average voters' concerns, it also has been shown in New York, according to a couple studies done by the Brennan Center, to both increase the amount of voter engagement, in other words, the amount of voters who will pay attention to the election and vote, and also the diversity of the candidates who can participate in the process, because you don't have to be rich to run. How would this program help our community? People say, we don't need this in Evanston, we don't have a problem with corruption, blah, blah, blah. And I say, that's fine, you're right. We don't have as big a problem with corruption here as we do in some of our other electoral systems. You have to think of this as a disease. Big money is a disease that affects our politics. We need a small donor matching system or a voucher system or some other form of public financing as a vaccine to give us some immunization protection against big money corrupting our politics. So that's the main way it will help us. It will also help us by enabling ordinary people to run without having to sell their souls to rich donors. That's the real virtue of the system. As Jay mentioned, this is not a panacea. It's not going to solve all our problems. It will not guarantee victory in every election. It will not guarantee that rich people do not come in and use their resources disproportionately, spend more money than the other candidates. But what it does do is it's intended to give average candidates the opportunity to get their message out and run a viable campaign. I've heard objections to this that, well, this will never work. I say, look at the Barack Obama campaigns, look at the Bernie Sanders campaigns. There are lots of examples of this actually being able to work. Look at the New York City experience, which is over 30 years, where it's worked, even though they've had very rich people run for office and sometimes succeed. It's worked in general for their municipal elections. The other big objection I hear to small donor matching systems is, well, but we can't afford it. It's too expensive. Yes, there is a lot of money in politics. We spend billions and billions of dollars. We spend about $10 to $13 billion every national election cycle. However, we have to put it in context. It's about the same amount of money that we spend on Halloween. Okay? We can afford Halloween. We have it every year. We can also afford democracy. A small donor matching system is a very, very tiny, turns out to be a very, very tiny expense compared to the overall budgets of any of the places that use it. So typically, the cost of a small donor matching system is between 0.01%, that's 1/100th of a budget, and 0.5 or 0.6% of 1% of the overall budget. So yes, it involves some money, but it is money that it is an amount that we can afford, certainly an amount we can afford for our democracy. Finally, the question, people say, well, where's it going to come from here? We have a big budget deficit in Evanston and so on. Well, we do have money problems here in Evanston, like most jurisdictions have. However, we do have discretion in where we spend our money still. And one of the sources, this is just an example, one of the sources that's been identified is that every year Evanston gets $1 million from Northwestern in lieu of them paying property taxes. Okay? That money is totally discretionary as to where it's spent. Now, if we were to adopt a small donor matching system in Evanston, it would cost about $500,000 per election cycle every 4 years. So that's about $125,000 a year on average. This is one place it could come out. It could come out of other places. But we do have the capacity to use our discretion and to use our existing funds in a way to fund this program. Thank you.
Next, this is going to be Patrick Keenan-Devlin. When I first spoke to him about campaign finance reform, a lot of people, one, don't know what I'm talking about. But I think he really made it about the people and about values. And I've never thought about this reform like that, but it's just the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do. It's the right way to reform a system to make sure that people's voices are heard and that the system's held accountable to staying there. So I'm pleased to announce Patrick Keenan-Devlin to talk about why Evanston.
I am here because I support public financing of campaigns. Because it's the right thing to do, as Ivy already said. And let me tell you folks, it's always been the right thing to do. You know, I was an advocate back in Springfield, I can't believe it was nearly 10 years ago. And I worked with Common Cause. And I worked with the Illinois Campaign for Political Reform. And we drafted together a bill called the Lincoln Act. And it was a public finance campaign model. Now, who could be against something called the Lincoln Act, right? But it died, right? It died in committee. Now, it wasn't the first time that public finance campaigns have been tried. How many people here remember the legendary Dawn Clark Netsch? Dawn Clark Netsch passed the first public financing bill in 1983. I wasn't alive. Nearly 35 years ago. And Governor Thompson, in his veto message, said this: "It is an idea whose time has not yet come." This is an idea that's past due, folks. It's past due. And we cannot wait for Springfield to give us the answer. We have to start from the bottom up. We have to start building a movement that is municipality to municipality, county to county, region to region. And why not start right here in Evanston? I've lived in this town for 15 years, and I love this community. And I know that we can do this. It makes sense for Evanston to do this because it reflects our values. Anyway, now I'm going to make this a little equity. Public financing raises up all voices equally. Inclusiveness, I heard. Public financing diversifies candidates seeking public office. And engagement. Public financing increases participation by voters. You know, in talking to Ivy and getting ready for today, she brought up an issue. She said, you know, it's going to be very hard to answer some of the questions that are raised by elected officials, by our neighbors. And the one question she brought up was, how do you prove that this would really diversify the candidate pool? And set aside what David Melton just showed us, and what Jay just showed us in terms of how it actually has already in practice created a diversified candidate pool. I would say, without even seeing those graphs, those charts, those numbers, I know in my heart that there are community members in Evanston right now, maybe years ago, who sat around their kitchen tables and thought, man, I would love to run for school board. I would love to run for city council. I would love to run for mayor. My God, I have no idea how to do it. And so this gives those folks that voice, that option to run and hopefully win. Now, I also thought of other questions that people will probably start asking. So, how will you pay for it, right? How can we afford it? How can you guarantee that only legitimate candidates run? But here's what I would ask them right back in their faces. What are you willing to give up to build a more equitable, inclusive, and engaged community? What are you willing to give up to build a community that truly reflects our values? A community where all voices should be heard and invited to participate. Those of you who know what I do for my day job probably are not surprised that I love Brian Stevenson. This is a quote probably for all of you Brian Stevenson fans. You've heard him say before. But he said, I don't believe that the opposite of inequity is wealth. We talk too much about money. I believe that the opposite of inequity is justice. I believe that public financing builds a more just community. So let's show Springfield what an empowered and just community looks like. Can I have an amen?
Amen.
I now have the real honor and privilege of inviting two longtime champions for publicly financed campaigns, long before they ran for office themselves. The man is the sponsor of the Small Donor Democracy Matching System for Fair Elections Act, our state senator, and State Representative Wallace, the chief sponsor of the Small Donor Democracy Matching System for Fair Elections Act. Daniel, Litesa, would you come up and address these good questions?
Thank you very much, Ivy and Common Cause and ICPR, and to the candidates for including us in this. I'm going to be really quick, but extremely specific. Right? We all know who the president is right now and the kind of grotesque corruption that swirls around the administration because of the nexus with money, government, and politics. We all know who the governor of Illinois is and how he got to be there. We all, many of us at least, followed fairly closely the Democratic primary for a governor that just took place, and I did at least. I was actually really busy during a lot of it, but I paid fairly close attention nonetheless. But why Evanston? Why specifically Evanston? And I want to focus on a very specific comment that David made that I really agree with, which is, I don't think that we have a big corruption problem in Evanston. I don't see that we have a big corruption problem in Evanston. To be perfectly frank, I can't point to a single decision made by the city government of Evanston that makes me think, oh, they did that because of a campaign contribution. Yuck, I don't see that in Evanston. So why are we having this conversation? Well, let's look at the most recent election for mayor of Evanston, where the candidate who won, who's a friend of mine, by the way, spent well over $100,000 of his own money, breaking all kinds of records, and won narrowly. By the way, he's an affluent white man from the north side of Evanston, and a lot of people were kind of concerned about the amount of money he spent, but guess what? He was running against a primary opponent, the person who also made it to the runoff, who was also an affluent white man from the north side of Evanston with the ability to pay for his own campaign. And then let's go back to the previous competitive mayoral election in 2009, whose victor was a very close friend of mine who I think was a phenomenal mayor. In fact, I feel so strongly about her that I was the manager of her campaign in 2009. She also is a wealthy white woman from the north side of Evanston who was able to spend a fair amount of her own money in that race. And she was running in that race against 3 other white candidates, all at least upper middle class, and all but one from the north side of Evanston, the other from the south side of Evanston, but close to the lake. Yeah, Litesa, the applause, the laugh lines are kind of surprising. And so, to me, the question isn't, are these people good people or bad people? In my opinion, they're good people. All of them. All 6 of the people I just talked about. Good mayors, governance that's not about corruption. But look at the city of Evanston and look at the people who are able to run. Look at this city with its diversity, its racial diversity, and its dramatic economic diversity. And look who feels able to run. And now, don't just think about what that means for the skin color and geographic home base and economic background of the person who happens to wind up being mayor. Think about what that means for communities across Evanston, who feels like the system is likely to represent them, who is likely to participate, and then track that to how voter turnout happens in Evanston. Compare voter turnout in the 6th and 7th wards of Evanston to the 5th ward of Evanston. None of this is a surprise. None of this is a surprise. This is a system that in a consistent way lifts up the voices of some and depresses the voices of others, and then people respond rationally to that by walking away and saying, hey, I guess the system isn't for me. That's what you gotta fix. And Evanston, I believe, is the perfect place to fix it. Yes, Patrick, because of those values that this community takes very, very seriously, because it's a place where it's not about pointing a finger at a corrupt public official. On the contrary, it's about saying, hey, good public officials we like and agree with, who can agree with us that the system isn't quite working, let's use the tools we have to fix the system. I hope that Patrick is dead wrong, that we can't wait for Springfield to act. I hope Springfield acts soon, gosh darn it. Next week would be great. Wednesday, for instance, regardless of what Springfield does or doesn't do, the city of Evanston needs to act as well. And if Evanston takes bold action, which I believe is achievable with the power of people in this room. One of the beautiful things about living in a small or medium-sized town is you don't need 10,000 people marching in the streets to change policy. You need a big room full of passionate people willing to knock on those doors and make those calls. So I thought it was pretty bold of, I think it was Bobby, who at the very beginning of this said, everybody raise your hand if you're willing to sign your commitment cards. That was, you know, I'd do the whole morning if people are willing to sign one at we start. But I hope at the end of this day, at least, that everyone in this room is willing to join me in signing a commitment card to spend real time pushing on this issue, because I believe that we have the power to get this done in Evanston. I believe that when we do that, it will change who in the city is heard and who in the city is no longer ignored, and that will change who participates and who turns out, what our governments look like and what our governments do and who our governments most listen to. And I'm convinced that if we do that, we will will spread this movement from municipality to municipality to municipality. And then if, unfortunately, Patrick turns out to be right that now isn't yet the time for action in Springfield, then once a whole bunch of communities across Illinois do it, we know that that's when Springfield will act, and that's when eventually Washington will act. And that's how we will fundamentally transform this cancerous system of money and politics that has been so vicious in pushing people who are most in need of representation out of the system and silencing their voices. Thank you for being a part of this. I'm ready to learn.
I'm going to talk a little bit from just my own perspective and my own experience. So I am currently a state rep. I got into political systems by volunteering. And I was actually appointed the first time and replaced my predecessor on the ballot in that general election. I can say with much confidence that if that had not been the route for me, I probably would not be standing before you as a state representative and as a former candidate for lieutenant governor. There's no way I would have had the money to do that. Because in addition to being a policymaker, I'm a mom, a single mom. And the wage disparities that exist for women of color, and for mothers is very real. And those wage disparities impact the wealth gap. And the wealth gap impacts whether or not you have $100,000 or even $1,000 laying around to be the seed money for a campaign in public office. So that's just not always an option. Along the trail, I kind of talked about the fact that the gross, or the net worth for Black women in particular, is about $100. 100, not 1,000, not 100,000, $100. Yet we have huge student loan debt because we go to school and we are highly educated, but we don't always see that because, again, the wage disparities, right? About 67 cents for every dollar a white man makes is what a Black woman would make. So that's why this particular conversation is so important. So not just geographically with Evanston hopefully leading the way, and then I'm going to make all y'all come out to Rockford. Yeah. But if you're leading the way and making this happen, then you open up a system to people who have been left out, completely left out because of how economics work. And so I'll just leave with something that I just thought of after watching the video back there, that money impacts policy and not just politics. And so,
like she said, signing the pledge cards. So we're going to take a few minutes just for you guys to fill it out, but also write your questions. And then Brian. Okay.
Public financing is about our willingness to invest in a democracy that works. It's an expenditure of public funds that is necessary. It's an expenditure of public funds that's worthwhile.
Democracy is the fact that we all have to face up to. If we want politicians to actually be accountable to and answerable to us, the average voter, us, the average people, we have to make it possible for politicians to be able to survive relying on us, the average voters, rather than relying on wealthy people to give them their money and get them into office. Vouchers still cost money, public money, in the sense that it's not free money. Its difference is it's not coming out of your own pocket when you give a voucher to somebody. It's coming out of your city's.
It's coming out of your pocket when you pay your taxes.
It's coming out of your pocket to the extent that you pay your taxes, but it's not as directly coming out of your pocket. You're giving away some of your city's money rather than your own personal funds. That's the basic difference between the two systems. Obviously, there are advantages and disadvantages.
One of the advantages, or the disadvantages, depending how you think about it, with the Seattle situation, is Seattle allows you to use your vouchers and donate them to a political action committee. Not something I'm personally thrilled about, but it is in fact a substantial difference than the way that the small donor match program would work. So.
So just to be clear, we're not going to walk away with this answer today. We're going to be leading a variety of conversations and working groups, which you all will be invited, that we have your information, to dive into these two options to figure out what best is for Evanston. So both systems exist. Vouchers is newer in Seattle. Small donor has been in existence for decades in a variety of places. So one thing I'll also say is we've met with a variety of elected officials over the last few years, and something I've heard from a few of them is, well, this is a novel idea, this is interesting, we're not New York, we're not California, right? And so we have to change the way people think about this state and start to understand that these systems work and they exist in other places and they can exist here, whether we do vouchers or whether we do a small donor matching system. So I want to currently the parties pick who runs, who they back. How does this system change that? And if not, how do we get at that?
The way that I would view these systems, both of them, is a counterweight. They don't eliminate anything that's bad. They just put a weight on the other side of the scale. Let's say if the party wanted to spend, the better part of $1 million on a state representative primary for some reason, none of the stuff we're talking about would have any impact on their right to do that, but it would allow the people to rise up and actually have a voice for a different candidate. The basic framework here that we're operating under is the idea that the Supreme Court has done a bunch of awful stuff to allow certain types of spending, certain habits of form to create kind of people being accustomed to other types of spending. It's very hard to put those genies back in those bottles, and it's impossible to put the Supreme Court genie back in the bottle without electing different presidents and U.S. senators, which would be a good idea. And so we're trying to just operate in the system that exists and build next to it a better parallel system. Here's what's great about New York. In New York, the candidates have to choose. Am I going to operate in the old system, or am I going to voluntarily accept lower limits and operate in the new system? And you know what happens? That decision itself becomes a campaign issue, right? When a candidate says, you know what, I'm going to take the $500,000 from the party, so to hell with your small donor matching. The fact that they chose to say to hell with your small donor matching itself becomes a liability in the campaign. And that's what we're trying to set up here. We're trying to set up a system where we as voters not only have our voices lifted up, but then we can pressure candidates to participate in the clean system voluntarily.
So one thing we hear a lot is, I don't want my money going to helping the other woman or the other guy. Why should my money be used to help a candidate run? How?
I think that could be the question, or could be said for just about anything that our government spends money on. And so we have to make the decision as to whether or not this is for the greater good, or are we going to be in a position of being selfish and saying, I don't want my particular dollars to go elsewhere. That can be argued for any public spending or of public dollars. I mean, the same with neighborhood
We don't
schools.
allow people to stop paying taxes because they wish that Planned Parenthood were defunded. Right? We make a collective decision as a people about what our public priorities are. Those include, in some jurisdictions, funding Planned Parenthood, and some people disagree with that, and they can express their disagreement through the next election. They can't just express their disagreement through just choosing not to pay taxes. We already use public resources to subsidize politicians getting their message out. Certainly when you think about the regulation of public airwaves and the various kind of equal time doctrines that exist, when you think about the fact that the county clerk will post campaign statements from anybody running for office using public resources, the difference between that and this system is that it's not using public resources to broadcast any old message. It's using public resources to amplify the expressed wishes of the public through their choice to make their own small donations. And I think that's actually a really valuable service, to have a system where candidates are heard based on lots of people wanting them to be heard, not based on one very wealthy interest wanting them to be heard.
You talk a little bit about what you think it's going to take to win it in Evanston and what's it going to take to pass your bill, both of your bills now, in the state.
Well, in Evanston, I think we're looking at a lot of power in this room. I'm going to talk to my alderman. I hope you all do the same. I hope we all talk to the mayor. Let's get out of this room and start sprinting and have the goal of getting this done in the course of a matter of, it won't be weeks, but it's maybe months or maybe a year or two, but that's the time horizon we should have in mind. Now in Springfield, we passed a bill out of the House last spring. Senate, what am I? Happy Saturday, everybody. We passed a bill out of the Senate last spring. It's waiting in the House for a vote now. An analogous bill is up for a committee hearing this Wednesday. It's witness slip time for this, absolutely. What's the bill number, Jay?
5531.
House Bill 5531. It's time for us to really push to have this bill heard. I will say I've been in discussions with JB Pritzker about this very issue. I think this is an issue that, though JB and I had a lot of complicated discussions over the course of the last 6 months about money and politics, I think we mostly agreed, or at least mostly said that we agreed, that it was time to fix the system and do something differently. And I'm hoping to be able to link arms with JB and fight really hard and aggressively in concrete ways to make sure that the House moves forward with this, and those discussions are underway as well. So I would say if anybody's in touch with the Pritzker campaign or with JB himself, encourage him to work with us on this issue. Express our commitment and passion to working on this together, not in an adversarial way, but in a collaborative way that's actionable and quick. The time to do this is not right before the next election, it's right after the last election. The time is now.
So just a couple quick practical steps. I heard someone mention witness slips, so definitely if you go to ilga.gov, dashboard, find the bill. It's in Civ, elections and yes, and campaigns. Sign the witness slip, but also then share with your friends and family that they may need to call some of the people who are on that committee. And that's how you start to be able to push for a vote to get it out of committee. And then you need to expand and start calling people other than your own reps, because this is, I don't know, you're a very savvy group. In my district, in certain parts of it, I get bombarded with issues that I support, right? Instead of my neighbors being called because we know they don't support it. So I'm not saying that, people don't get that, but I think it's really important to reach out to people throughout the state on these particular issues and make sure that we're pushing them once we can get it out. Hopefully it's not just a subject matter hearing on Wednesday, but once we can get it out on Wednesday, being able to get those votes necessary on the floor. And don't forget, there are several Republicans who are retiring. There are several people who are not coming back. There'll be like 30 new people in the House next year. So there's opportunity for people to maybe do something really great on their way out, and you can help them do that by pushing them to vote for this bill.
We have a lot of Heckies. So even if you don't want to phone back, please come and eat Heckies with us. And everyone's here if you want to talk to people or ask more questions. But we're just very, very thankful, and we're ready to get the work started. So if you haven't handed it.
So yeah, when we first met up, we talked a lot about campaign finance reform, which we still will. But we also saw how that was connected to the equity work that I and Opal and Reclaim Evanston and Common Cause and tons of groups are also working towards. And so we can measure it. So we know right now that our system isn't working because, as Senator Biss said, we know who the donors are, especially who the big donors are. We know who's turning out to vote. In Evanston, any campaign person knows, 6, 7, and 3, and 1 even are deciding, elections oftentimes. What if we can turn those on its head? We can measure who turned out last election and who turns out once we campaign and try to turn them out. We know who the donors are, who's donating in Evanston. Can we change that the next election? Something that even our city clerk in Evanston was looking at the day he took office was what precincts. We know in Evanston what precincts are not turning out to vote, and it happens election cycle after election cycle after election cycle. Here's the issue, is we have elected officials who are still trying to commit to whether or not government has a responsibility to change that. Does government have a responsibility to invest in engaging these voters? It is up to this group to say loud and clear yes. Because if it doesn't happen, what will happen is we'll have a city clerk who is trying his hardest to invest his own office's resources in engaging new voters, but it's limited. And so if we can get our elected officials in Evanston to say, yes, it is our responsibility to invest in engaging new voters, we will have new issues prioritized. Now, I'm going to say something that may get stuff thrown at me, so Ivy, protect me. Let's create a shield. And this is not to say that these issues aren't important. It's more so in addition to, I think in Evanston, we need to talk about other issues. We spent years talking about Harley Clark Manson, and everybody knows that. We spent years talking about downtown master plans where, when it was happening, it wasn't even a good representation of the population in those meetings even. We spend years literally talking about issues that I can promise you people from communities that I organize in do not care about as much as you think they do. And it's just the hard, cold truth. And I'm not saying they're not important. What I'm saying is it's not what people care about. People want to care about the communities that organize with mass incarceration. They want to talk about child care. That's like something I hear all the time. Weekends, child care on weekends and at night. Like, this is where they're at. They want to talk about you can just tell that the reason why we're not talking about mass incarceration for 5 years straight, or we're not talking about how we spur economic development for 5 years straight in this community, is because all of these people aren't participating. If everybody can join us, yes, in campaign finance reform, but also with Equitable Evanston, where we'll be talking about economic justice and all these other issues, that would be a great service to this community. Yes, we just had a meeting at Evanston Township High School. It was a public financing discussion and kickoff event that is going to lead into what we're calling Equitable Evanston. It's a campaign that's going to be focused on passing a campaign finance ordinance in the city of Evanston. I think from an equity, I'll take it with an equity lens. Right now we have a small group of people who donate to campaigns. We have a small amount of people who determine elections, local elections, and statewide elections because they actually vote. And we have, even smaller amount of people that run. There it is, that run for office. And so ultimately, we have a system that is really focused on investing and prioritizing people with money and people who vote. And so, what happens to the majority of folks who feel disconnected from their local governing bodies and state and national governing bodies? And so, both of these programs, whether it's voucher or whether it's small donor, are going to answer the question, how do we get more people engaged? How do we get more people to vote? How do we get more people to show up to city council, to show up to committees, to run for office, to speak during public comment, to organize their local community around issues that are important? How do we do that? And I think this can begin to start to address that fundamental problem that we have.
So I'll tell you about the two options. So the two options that were discussed today are one, which is a small donor matching program, and we also discussed vouchers. The small donor matching program has been implemented in municipalities throughout the nation. It's a more popular model. New York does it. Typically with that system, it limits the amount of money a candidate can raise. In New York, it's $500 that you can raise from a single donor, and then that money up to $150 is matched in New York 6 times, in other places, 3, somewhere usually between 3 to 6 times. And so that'll turn a $25 donation into a $150 donation. So that's a great system to make sure that small donors are
matched by public.
And it's matched by public dollars.
Clear,
yeah. And so candidates have to qualify for that system by getting petition signatures, by raising a certain threshold and by becoming viable candidates. The option that I prefer is the voucher option, and that's been tried in Seattle. It was implemented in 2017 after a ballot initiative that passed in 2016 as a part of a larger reform package. And in Seattle, they have what they call democracy vouchers. And I think that'll work best here in Evanston because we don't have an issue like our Congress or Chicago or other places with corruption here in Evanston, at least from my viewpoint. I think our bigger problem is a problem that's shared throughout the nation. It's participation. It's folks feeling like they have a voice in our democracy. And the vouchers give, in Seattle, $100 to every registered voter in the city. And if you're not registered, you can apply to receive the voucher. You get 4 $25 vouchers. You can give it to any candidate or political action committee. And what that has done in Seattle is it's shown that it's increased participation amongst low propensity voters. So that's folks, low-income folks, voters of color, and young voters. And in Seattle, the greatest thing is that 85% of donors in the 2017 election were first-time donors. So this means that we're increasing the number of folks who are participating. Also, the greatest number of organizations, Win-Win and another organization from DC did a study. And what they found is that of first-time voters, many of those first-time voters were folks who were also donors. And so it's shown to increase voter participation. And I think that's an issue we have here in Evanston. You know, in our last municipal election, we saw 30% turnout. In the municipal election before that, we saw 10% turnout.
And from what wards?
Throughout the city, but typically lower voter turnout tends to affect our lower income communities here in Evanston. So that's the 5th ward, that's the 8th ward, that's the 2nd ward. And we see very high voter turnout and participation in donors, and most of our donors coming from the 6th and 7th ward. And most of our mayors come from the 6th and 7th ward. And so by implementing a small donor match program or a voucher program, I think we can increase the number of folks who are running from throughout the city, and we can also increase participation in folks throughout the city. And that's a goal of my office as the local election official.
So I have 2 questions. One is, what do you want to ask people to do if they watch this video and they do anything, one thing first? So what should they do?
I think folks should, one, look into the 2 systems. Common Cause and Evanston Collective have committed to listening to the voice of the people and saying that, one, yes, we do need some kind of public financing reform, but there are several models. So I'd say first look into the 2 models, see which one you support, get involved in the campaign, and contact the mayor, contact your alderman, and let them know that you support public financing of campaigns and that you want to see Evanston be a Midwestern leader and making sure that all of our voices are heard in our democracy.
And where can they find
the last thing I'll say is, what we also can measure is, and the clerk has been a leader on this, is, you know, who's not voting in elections. We know it. Election cycle after election cycle, like we know down to the precinct, precincts that are down to the household, down to the individual, who the lower voter turnout individuals are and precincts are. And so we can flip that. We know this is how many people aren't voting, and let's see, after campaigning, after we invest, after we educate, how many people vote in the next cycle. We can measure that. We know people who are funding now in Evanston. We can look it up. All this is publicly available. How many people, after we pass this voucher system, let's say, now are funding different candidates of their choice. So all of these, we can measure who's running for office. It's the same thing that Daniel said. Like, I would say probably 80 to 90% of the mayors and elected officials probably come from those 3 wards in Evanston that everybody knows about. 6, which is in Northwest Evanston, 7, which is in Northeast, and 1, which is by the lake. And so we know, okay, this is how many people in the past 2 decades, ran for office. This is where they lived. Let's look at the next decade, the next 2 decades, and see who runs. Like, all this stuff can be measured, basically.
But campaign finance reform basically trickle down equity.
Trickle up equity. Trickle up.
Yes.
We're starting a campaign called Equitable Evanston, which we'll try to figure out in short amount of time, like what's the, where's the community at? Do we want small donor? Do we want voucher? And then we'll try to organize folks around the campaign. So, calling our alderman, yes, but also sometimes before you call the alderman, you get people behind you first to say, hey, look, we have a coalition and kind of a grassroots organization built, and this is what people are saying they want. Equitable Evanston is definitely the campaign we want folks to join. Right now, again, as the clerk said, we're trying to determine is it going to be small donor? Is it going to be voucher? I am also
Both of us
of the
are
inclination that
supporters of
it should be voucher. I think it's wonderful, especially for Evanston. I don't think it's a candidate issue per se, and if it is a candidate issue, I think what we can combine with voucher is we can try to give people try to make it increase the salaries of our elected officials. That's something that's been talked about. Because right now, I mean, we've talked a lot about living wage. It's not a living salary to be an alderman, and so you're more likely to get candidates who are like well off or who have retired and have done really well, running for office. But if it was a livable salary, then I think more people would say, hey, this is an opportunity to actually find the time to do